Hello, everyone. Welcome to the fourth and final MVS Proseminar event for the semester. My name is Mitchell Akiyama. I'm an assistant professor in the Visual Studies department. And before we get started, I just want to acknowledge the land that we're on, the ancestral traditional home of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Huron-Wendat, and the Seneca. And I have been doing slightly longer-winded land recognitions recently, but I'll tone it down tonight. But I just want us to reflect on our being here as settlers, but how complicated that relationship can be, because we have all settled differently and for different reasons. But I want to express my gratitude for being here and working and living on these lands. So tonight, our guest is, and for those of you just joining for the first time, the MVS Proseminar series is a part of the curriculum for the Masters of Visual Studies program. So it's a requirement for the master's students, and we curate a slate of artists and curators from all over the place to come and talk, give a talk to the students and to the public, and also to do visits with the students. And our guest tonight, I'm very excited to introduce Cheryl Sim from the Phi Foundation. Cheryl is the managing director and curator at the Phi Foundation for Contemporary Arts, and she's also a media artist and scholar. She began her professional life at Studio D at the National Film Board of Canada, which led to her to video art and involvement with artist-run culture. As an artist, her work in video and installation has been presented in North America and Europe, and persistently deals with questions of identity formation, women's labor, and relations of power. Her work as the managing director and curator at Phi Foundation for Contemporary Art has been greatly informed by artist-run ethos and learning from the margins. Exhibitions that she's has curated include Growing Freedom, Yoko Ono, Relations, Diaspora and Painting, and Stan Douglas, Revealing Narratives. And Cheryl is an incredibly multifaceted person. She received a PhD in the Études et Pratiques des Arts program at UQAM, where she explored clothing and its importance to diasporic identities. And she published a book on that called Wearing the Cheongsam, Dress and Culture in Chinese Diaspora, that was published by Bloomsbury in 2019. And I met Cheryl many years ago when she asked me to participate in a really wacky and fun event. There was a Christian Markley exhibition in Montreal at what was then the DHC Foundation. And Cheryl invited me to come and DJ with Christian Markley with his collection of Christmas records. And Christian Markley's collection of Christmas records is bigger than most avid vinyl collectors' collection of records, period. And it was so much fun, and Cheryl was such a pleasure to work with, and I'm really glad to see her again in this context. So please join me in welcoming Cheryl.
Thanks, Mitch. It's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you. It's an honor, right, to be asked to talk about your stuff. And it's a real pleasure to be amongst colleagues here. Thanks to MVS for this invitation. I'm going to walk you through a few stories and artworks and exhibitions that reveal key moments that have showed me something really useful and that have stood the test of time, and I hope it will resonate with you. Oh yeah, this is our current show. This is an image from our current show with Yayoi Kusama. These are paintings from her Eternal Soul series, My Eternal Soul series, and this is how I feel most of the time in regards to art and being of service to it. So my parents are immigrants. My father was born in Swatow in the south of mainland China. He spent his teenage years in Hong Kong and went to university in Texas. And that's where he met my mom, who was born in the Philippines and was finishing studies in the School of Nursing. And they both took up permanent residency in Canada in the late 1960s. And I was born in Hamilton in 1971, and I lived in the suburbs of Toronto as a young child, and I moved to a small village in Quebec with my family in 1982. I talk about my parents because I've spent my whole life talking about where I am and who I am and where I come from. And I've gotten really comfortable with asserting it. And I would maybe also talk about how they formed my kind of cultural life. They were really interested in the performing arts. They loved music mostly. But once in a while, they took me and my sister to art museums. And one of my favorites became the McMichael Art Gallery, of all places, which left a big impression on me. But my real education and exposure to contemporary art came much, much later. So this is a photo of me at a multicultural festival in Toronto. It's now defunct. It was called Caravan. These kinds of festivals were really popular in the 1970s, and I show this because it was the time when I first became aware of my insider-outsider status, sort of being half Chinese but not speaking Cantonese or Mandarin, and getting older. Sort of my looks were not easily placed and sort of caused some consternation, both within mainstream society and the Chinese community. Of course, this had a big impact on my experience and worldview. So, not being easily placed and asked all the time where I come from, I rejected having visible ethnicity out of experiences of racialization. But then I saw this. This is dragon for Chinese dragon dance, and this particular dance is performed by girls. And when I saw this dragon and the girls who were performing with it, I thought, this is amazing. And I became really curious about my Chinese identity, and later the drive to express and investigate the benefits of multiplicity and the importance of revealing suppressed narratives became central to my art and curatorial ways of being and doing. So in many ways, what this picture reminds me of are two fundamental ideas that have rooted my work, and those are, what are my questions, and how can I be of service? Getting to the heart of these questions is an ongoing pursuit. It's a total practice, but I believe that identifying your questions and focusing on how to be of service can ground one's work, so that when things get confusing, and they will, when you feel unmoored, and you will, you can come back to those questions and take the focus off yourself and put it back onto your questions, which are ultimately linked with how to make a meaningful contribution through art, people, and culture. So I'll tell you about the early days. So Mitch alluded to the fact that I started off at the National Film Board of Canada. I actually did an undergrad degree at what's now called the Toronto Metropolitan University. I did a radio and television arts degree. I thought I was going to be the next Connie Chung. I think that's what my parents really wanted too. And I started doing this course, and it was so industry oriented. It was so much about the business. Like I was telling Samantha today that the slogan was, "It's a deadline business." And this was not speaking to my, I guess, desire to tell stories. What they did do, though, was introduce me to the Studio D of the National Film Board, which was the feminist studio, and a very important initiative spearheaded by a woman named Kathleen Shannon in the 1970s. And I worked within the studio for a program called New Initiatives in Film, which was a program started by Sylvia Hamilton, and it was designed to address the misrepresentation and underrepresentation of Indigenous women and women of color in film. And I was hired to be a production coordinator for a film institute, which was kind of like emerging filmmakers, sort of a 3-week kind of deep dive, baptism by fire into filmmaking. And I have to tell you, working at the National Film Board, picture it, it's the early 90s, okay? I graduated into a recession. There were no jobs. This was the first generation probably to graduate into a world where we would not surpass our parents in terms of class status or income. And cultural institutions were taking a big hit. There were, the recession meant massive cuts to institutions like the National Film Board, and It's in Montreal, so there was a referendum going on to separate from the rest of Canada. So this was a pretty intense cultural situation going on. But man, was it amazing to be there and to experience the unequal dynamics of power in action on a day-to-day basis. And I feel like that was such an instructive, amazing opportunity, to have that kind of up close and personal experience with how to read and negotiate complex terrain. So as painful as it was, I'm extremely grateful for that opportunity. This was the little logo for New Initiatives in Film. But in equal measure and in a more positive note, my time there introduced me to the incredible film and video work by Black, Indigenous, people of color, and queer artists. Their work affected and shaped my worldview in a way that would deeply inform my curatorial and art practices. And what their art impressed on me was the importance and benefit of presenting a multiplicity of voices and to never let the discourse settle, which was an idea imparted to me by Richard Fung, who is one of my heroes. And him saying that, this was he was a member of my MA defense that left such an indelible mark with me. So the idea of opening up the field of discussion on a topic or a question, rather than trying to own the truth, right, is really freeing and empowering, and making space for a variety of stories from as many perspectives as possible gives us a better chance of understanding that there are a range of ways of looking at things, and that the polyphony is enriching and it builds empathy. So the importance of a multiplicity of voices has become a really important part of how I approach the content and the form of what I make, as well as how I think about making exhibitions, and by extension, working as part of a team. I also characterize my work as being informed by a strategy of hybridity and politicized sensuousness. As an artistic approach, a strategy of hybridity is informed by the writings of people like Homi Bhabha, of course, but also a writer named Ian Eng, who wrote a really amazing book called On Not Speaking Chinese. And it reflects a conceptual desire to use forms and genres in various combinations to allow for an ongoing mutability and flexibility in creation. And from a politicized standpoint, hybridity can employ tactics of combining that can call attention to historically and culturally formed unequal relations of power. And then the idea of politicized sensuousness. That's something I coined that I've been using that seems to get to a really interesting quality that really draws me to certain art practices. And that refers to an aesthetic strategy of using formal beauty to relay a critical message. And I find this approach can be quite productive as a way to open up audience receptivity towards challenging ideas, difficult ideas. And this way, a stylistically sumptuous proposal might disarm the viewer while still bearing critical teeth. And I illustrate these two ideas with an installation view of works by Yinka Shonibari, CBE, who's an artist that we presented at the foundation, who I think employs both of these approaches with incredible skill. So now I'm going to tell you a little bit of work that I've done as an artist, but full disclosure, I am like an artist less than half the time, maybe like 25%, that's even generous, I think. But I started off really focused on an art practice. And this is my first single channel video work. What you're seeing, this blue thing here, this teal thing, is actually the VHS cover that I designed for the box that the VHS went into. And a few colorful phases was made in 1995, and it explored everything I wanted to say about growing up as a Canadian-born woman of color in a post-settler context. And through three questions. The first one was, if you don't mind me asking, where are you from? You know what they say about Oriental girls. And the third one was, has anyone ever called you a banana? And I liked to play with a lot of television genres like the game show and infomercials, and ultimately I wanted to inspire the viewer to contemplate their own relationship to ethnicity and to celebrate difference. And the works that came after continued to explore and document the lives and experiences of women from a feminist and post-colonial perspective through a research-based methodology and an intergenre, interdisciplinary, and autoethnographic approach. So I end up being a lot in my own work. In 2007, at the same time I started at Phi Foundation, and Phi Foundation was called DHC Art at the beginning. I began an MA in Media Studies at Concordia Communications, and I decided to do a research creation project, which was a really amazing way to make a new work. And the question I wanted to explore was whether the wearing of the cheongsam, the Chinese dress, could help me reconnect with my lost sense of Chinese heritage. And in order to explore that question, I interviewed 5 Montreal women of Chinese heritage, and I used a strategy of just taking their voices and creating a kind of audio montage to get a sense of the various ways, wearing practices, attitudes, ideas of the dress, and to make this kind of edit of excerpts that I hope could give us a sense of what these women were thinking about that particular dress in relationship to their heritage. And I combined that audio montage with images of family photos, clips from the film In the Mood for Love, archival images of cheongsam tailors and women in cheongsam, filmed images from a Montreal-based tailor's boutique and studio, and images of myself getting fitted for and wearing a tailor-made cheongsam. And the final work was called Ode to the Cheongsam. And then, you know what happens. People say, oh, I'm done, MA, I'm good. And then, of course, you need to do a PhD because you have so many questions still that you need to explore. And you channel that into 4 years of real enjoyment. And I felt I needed to expand my single channel video work to include installation. And that combined multi-channel video, the creation of objects, audio montage, and site specificity. And this time, I kind of enlarged the basin of responses to 20 Canadian-born women of Chinese heritage from across the country, and created a kind of installation project that was called the Fitting Room. And there were 3 interrelated works. There was Chinese Screen, which is this sort of 4-channel installation work with rear projection. Hybrid dresses, which were 3 dresses that I made that were sort of answering to the basin of responses I was getting from this 20 women about their attitudes towards the dress. And then at the top there is this thing which was the fitting room, which was basically you walked into a transparent sort of changing room, and then you'd have a projection onto your own body of a montage of different Hollywood films of people putting on clothes and trying on, their identities, which is something we end up doing very publicly. And then I had this all displayed at a mall in Chinatown called the Swatow Plaza, and I rented 3 commercial kiosk spaces and presented these works, one in each of these kiosks. And I hoped it would evoke additional layers of the consideration around commerce, labor, and exchange involved with the Chinese dress. And furthermore, the infiltration of a non-commercial, very non-commercial art exhibition within the context of a Chinatown mall would also be analogous to my insider-outsider status as a person of sort of illegible Chinese heritage. In 2015, I had this opportunity to do a residency at an artist-run center called Obero, and it's a place I worked at for 10 years. And the residency was presented as part of the Axiazi Festival, which is the festival to celebrate Asian heritage in Montreal. And I created a performance installation, so taking it a step further, based on the life of my granduncle, Thomas Wang. He was a relative who I never knew. He was my grandmother's brother, but whom I feel a great affinity. He loved jazz and dancing, and he lived in Shanghai in the 1930s. He was arrested for dealing in foreign currency and later executed by order of General Chiang Kai-shek. And I worked with family archives and photos, a feature film, published images and articles, as well as audio recordings, and I performed a set of songs. I actually also was making music for a really long time, so I decided I wanted to perform a set of songs that I thought would be on his playlist. So I'll just walk you a little more in depth. So the four-screen installation was riffing on the film Shanghai Express, which I kind of remixed and integrated with images of Thomas, who was in Shanghai at the time that film would have been made, and sort of speaking to the fall of the city. And then we had chairs and it like set up like a kind of a bar, like a kind of a cocktail lounge in front of that. And that sort of gives you a sense of the images that it was sort of synchronized 4-channel video installation. And then I had all these documents that my grandmother had kept from the time that they left. Her family and her husband, my grandparents, left Swatow. She'd basically been keeping all these contracts and leases of property that they had in Shanghai, which of course was all repossessed by the Communist Party. But I ended up with them, and it's a suitcase full of these things. And so I thought I would kind of paper the whole room in these documents to kind of immerse ourselves in this sort of other time, another world. And also talk about loss. The execution of Thomas Wang was actually documented in Life magazine, and weirdly enough, it's the same edition, the same issue that has a roundtable interview around modernism led by Clement Greenberg. Anyway, that's just an aside, but this I wanted to sort of show that as a document as part of the installation. And then Thomas had written a letter to his mother before he was executed, and my other granduncle, his brother, Harry, had the letter, and he translated it into English. He gave context to the letter, and I had my father and my sister and myself read the letter, record it in audio, and then did a sort of audio montage that people could listen to whilst reading the letter. And then this is sort of documentation of the performance. So I enlisted my friend Parker Ma, who's a pianist and curator artist in Montreal, and so he accompanied me, and we decided to do the performance behind the screen. So there's another kind of slippage in terms of space and time there. All right, so a couple years later, this piece, I talk about this piece because, in terms of the multiplicity of voices, I think this one really honored that kind of idea. YMX, Migration, Land and Loss after Mirabel. So Montreal had this huge, massive airport that was built in coming out of the 1960s. It was a big kind of modernization, great optimism, massive hubris project. It was like the mayor of Montreal and who wanted to put Montreal on the map and wanted to create this hyper-modern airport, but it tanked. It totally didn't do anything that it promised to do. It was beautiful, but it was like an hour and a half out of the city. No one could it was just really a nightmare to use it, and it eventually became disused, and I think it was dismantled a couple of years ago. And so there's a professor at Concordia named Matt Soar, and he has a Montreal Signs project, and he recuperated a couple of those split flap signs. You see them still in European train stations, and said, why don't we make a work with this? So I did this. And what it is I wanted to explore the various narratives of displacement and rebirth that intersect with the story of Mirabel Airport. So it consisted of a labyrinthine passage, which were delineated by these stanchions, and along the path, the visitor would encounter different things. So one was a video work, and so we had these amazing archives from the NFB of a Vietnamese family arriving at Mirabel Airport, of birds flying, of these fields, that were basically agricultural fields around Mirabel, which had to be, the people who lived there had to be displaced completely. Birds had to be displaced. The indigenous folks living on those lands hundreds of years ago were displaced by the settlers. And I wanted to have 3 people speak to their experience of Mirabel. So there was a poet whose family were displaced as farmers. Then there was a writer named Kim Thuy, who was a refugee from Vietnam, who for her, Mirabel was rebirth. And then there was another person who was interviewed who had to claim refugee status coming from Sri Lanka with his mother and his sister. So all of these things kind of mixed together to kind of show you how unsettled and how complicated a site can actually be. It's another view. So there was the video, then the book of poetry that was written by one of the people who were interviewed, and then the split flap signs. I created a kind of poem, and we had a technician sort of figure out how to get one to respond to the other. So you'd have a word come up on one side and then another on the other, and then when you sat on the bench back there, you could kind of see the dialogue and the narrative coming up, around like the Ganegahaga people being displaced, and then agricultural land being taken over, and that the story continued. This is the last piece I'll talk about, which is, it was in a group exhibition called In Search of Expo 67, and I was invited to make a work there. It was called Un jour, one day, and the work was a 3-channel music video. I love the music video genre, and I've used it a few times, and I captured the Expo 67 theme song. It was called Un jour, and it was by Stéphane Venn, and I re-recorded it. I used my own voice and production, but totally different from the very bouncy, jovial, optimistic original version. And then for the visuals, we shot on site among the public artworks created for Expo 67. And then I made and wore this sort of futuristic jumpsuit inspired by the Expo 67 hostess uniform, and interspersed these live action images with photos from my parents' honeymoon spent at Expo 67. And with all of these elements coming together, I hope to explore and critique Expo's drive towards modernization, hopeful optimism, but also use of soft power, all examined through a feminist and diasporic lens. So curating, let's talk about curating and caring. I started at the Phi Foundation before it officially opened in 2007, and its original name was DHC Art. To talk about what curating means to me and how I do it, this is my office, by the way. I have to talk about Obero again. So Obero is that place that I worked at for 10 years where we did the Thomas Wang project. And this was my real introduction to working in an artist-run center. I met a woman, an artist, her name is Skawanati, in the 90s. We were working at the NFB together, and she introduced me to this place, which was started by Danielle Dion and Sue Schnee. They started this artist-run center in 1982, one of the early ones. And like the NFB, it was a place where I got to try all kinds of things. So if you get an opportunity to work in artist-run centers, or if you already do, then amazing, because people wear a lot of different hats. So you'll do everything from You know, you'll organize events, you'll maybe coordinate publications, exhibition coordinate. That's where I really learned how to, you know, clean wine glasses. I'm amazing at cleaning wine glasses because of working in an artist-run center, which is a really good skill, I can tell you. But they basically taught me everything I know and believe about art. Daniel and Sue were really influenced by Fluxus and imparted the idea that everything is art, and we are all artists, and art and life are inextricably linked. So artist-run centers can be excellent places to learn how to develop a lot of different skills, but mostly they can teach us of how, they teach us how to be of service to ourselves and others through art, and how to recognize and commit to art as an agent of expression, but also transformation and empowerment to really make a meaningful contribution. So let's talk a little bit, a little more about Obero. That's their old website. You kind of get the vibe, right? So, Phi Foundation, we're a nonprofit organization dedicated to the presentation of contemporary art. We try to program in a way that's international in scope, while responsive to the Montreal context, underscoring how all of the foundation's programming is, we want to make everything free of charge. We do 2 to 3 major exhibitions a year. We do an event program of events, and we have an education program. And we want to, sort of speak to accessibility on a variety of levels. So, for one, economic barriers, we offer everything free of charge. We also want to break down these sort of entrenched perceptions of what contemporary art is and who it's for, and really kind of drive home the idea that art is for everybody. So in everything we do, we want to reinforce that, art is part of everyday life, and that definitely has an impact on how you live your curatorial life. Right. Working here has me constantly asking myself what I can bring to the foundation's mission and the team. How can I honor our founder? And since we're a private foundation, how can we do something different and special with a deeper purpose that also pushes the limits of institutional conventions? Foundations are kind of great because, you have some freedoms that maybe a larger museum might not have. And as we all know, the term curator comes from the word curare, which means to take care of or to care. And that's a potent reminder that curating is about trust, collaboration, communication, about how to make exhibitions that care for the artists, the team that puts them together, and for fostering empowerment for communities we serve, which also means keeping a lookout for and acknowledging our blind spots and then addressing them with care. It's not always easy. Hilarious first show. Well, the show wasn't hilarious, but I find, this is the only trace of the show that I have. It's from 1997. It's called Recognition Asian Artists and Community. This was at Obero. This was an exhibition that brought together works by artists of Asian heritage that speak to family relationships as a lens through which to understand identity formation. And it was through, it was this search for understanding of one's multiplicity that seemed to be the creative force in all of these artists' work. The space. This is another fun thing that you think video programming can be, is like not sort of chunky enough. You can always work with the space. So they let me intervene with the room. And I wanted it to be like a family room. So we had fake wood paneling. We had like a vinyl couch and some like really 70s sort of fake veneer furniture, coffee table, lamps, and end tables. And then we just had all the VHS cassettes on the coffee table, and then people could just view the work in whatever order they wanted. Okay, now a little more recent. We had a 10th anniversary in 2017, and I really wanted to honor the founder's gift of the foundation by putting together a show of works that ruminated on the idea of gift, exchange, circulation, and obligation. And during my research, I was delighted to come across a book called The Gift, Creativity and the Artist in the Modern World by Lewis Hyde. It was first published in 1983, and he draws on fairy tales and anecdotes and sociological research, such as Marcel Mauss's 1924 Essai sur le don, Essay on the Gift, to formulate a theory on the essence and the ways of the gift. And what he explains is that gift exchange is not something that is simply at the center of a binary exchange. For the gift to truly come into being, it has to be given, received, and passed along. It has to change hands in a circular fashion and stay in constant motion. And the text really helped me get more deeply into the works themselves and how they resonated with one another. And in the selection, I was hoping to bring together a variety of ways of looking at gift and exchange through a range of formal and conceptual approaches. So we'll just blitz through the show. It started with Ischia by Felix Gonzalez Torres. That sort of welcomed us. And then we had 3 works together, Sunny Asu, and that's in the foreground. The Silent to the Burning. We had a collaborative project with Simran Gill around her book called Pearls, where she would, you would give her your favorite book and she'd rip it apart but make a necklace with it and give it back to you. And then there's only one image in the corner, but it's Li Mingwei's series of photos called Money for Art. We had Emily Jasir's Entry Denied, a concert in Jerusalem, which was a concert that never happened because all of these musicians were denied entry to Jerusalem, but she filmed them in New York, and then later on, years later, was able to reshare that film when she was allowed to show it in Jerusalem. Felix Gonzalez Torres again, untitled NRA, where visitors were invited to take one poster, and they were all gone after a month and a half. So then we put up a kind of explanation of like what happened here and what why this room is empty. Phil Collins, Free Photo Lab, where people gave him their undeveloped rules of film, and then he developed them for free when he was working at a photo lab, with the caveat that he got to keep one image for this project. Mike Kelly's little scene piece, Love, Theft, Gifting, and More Love, which was about seeing his girlfriend come home with a t-shirt with the logo that he had designed for a book cover and had no idea how it ended up on the t-shirt, but then decided to take it and make decals and give them away for free. And then Sergei Jensen does these paintings on money bags. Old money bags as the surface, for painting or as the primary medium. Li Mingwei's Sonic Blossom, where an unsuspecting visitor is invited by this sort of demigod and demigoddess to sit, and at which point they would sing them a Schubert lieder. Felix Gonzalez Torres, untitled Blue Placebo, and we ended up having very few of these candies left at the end of the show. And then Dora Garcia's Steal This Book, which consists of copies of a book that document 11 of her recent performative projects. You're invited to steal this book, but we also sell it. We were also selling it, so you were kind of faced with your own sort of moral dilemma on whether you were going to steal it or not, even though you were being invited to. And then the last show I wanted to share with you, and we'll go fairly quickly, is Relations, Diaspora, and Painting. And this was, another strategy to try and have like a multiplicity of voices. It included 23 artists from Canada, the US, and the UK. And there were a couple of texts that I just want to mention that were really, integral to this show. One was Stuart Hall's 1990 essay, Cultural Identity and Diaspora, and then Avtar Bra's essay, Cartographies of Diaspora, Contesting Identities. And of course, I've been reading a lot of Trinh Minh Ha and Edward Said, and all of these things came together in sort of fortifying a kind of conceptual backbone for the show. But ultimately, I just wanted to have a range of ways that artists were thinking through diaspora and expressing it through painting, sort of painting having a very Western-centric, art history. It seemed interesting to kind of, use that as a way to explore this question with that additional layer of criticality. I wanted to try and have as intergenerational a mix as possible, so you could see how these stories are not new, but they've been, if you look at works by Frank Bowling, for example, and the kind of issues that he was having as a Black artist, Caribbean artist living between London and New York, his story was resonating with, one of the younger artists in the show. So I hoped it created a kind of, again, this polyphony, this kind of jazz. So this is Firulai Baez, and then there's a little bit of Shauna Strauss here to the left. This is Hervin Anderson with a little Marigold Santos in the corner. This is Barclay Hendricks and Larry Achiampong towards the end there. Rajni Pereira, Marigold Santos. Here we have Maya Cruz Palaleo on the left and Kamruz Aram on the right. Rick Leong and Salman Tour at the far end. We had a Yoko Ono instruction painting. These are a diptych by Barty Kerr and a painting by Julia Moretu that blew my mind. That's Julie's painting again, but that's Frank Bowling's painting, and a Mickaleen Thomas. We have, a little Hajra Wahid moment. Lubaina Hamid, Curtis Talwis Santiago, Manuel Mathieu. Then we have Ed Pien next to Yinka Shonobari. And then, hard to see, but at the far end, that's Ginny Yu's piece. It's two works combined together, and those are glass untempered. And she was really exploring the intersection between diaspora, people of color diaspora, but also indigenous diaspora, which is an interesting conversation that I think needs to happen more and more. And then this is Cy Gavin. And Shauna Strauss and Jessica Sabogal made this kind. It's really huge. This is not a good image. It was a massive sort of photo transfer and painting on reclaimed wood with wood burning details as well. So yeah, that culminated too in a publication with 24 writers. And again, not all these writers were coming from an art history background or anything like that. We had poets. We had people from cultural studies backgrounds. So it became a way to continue that multiplicity of voices beyond the realm of the exhibition. And because it opened in the pandemic, it was supposed to open in April. It ended up opening in July. And then it closed again in September, which was extremely heartbreaking. But it took up residency in Calgary the following summer at the Esker Foundation, our sort of sister organization. And now you get a sense of that work more in terms of its scale. I just, because of talking to Samantha about Yoko, thought I'd slip a little Yoko slide in there. That was probably one of the most, it was like an I'm not worthy moment for sure to have a show with Yoko Ono. And if you have any questions about that, I can totally share all kinds of stories with you. But it was again a moment of great generosity and trust. So in closing, I guess I just want to underscore the importance these days of talking about collaboration and collegiality as so necessary for the sustainability of the ecosystem that we call the art world. It's, I think, part of my own desire to see some positive changes in the landscape, where artists and curators and cultural organizations and commercial galleries all work much more in concert with each other, recognizing that we're part of something much bigger than ourselves. I've seen that the scarcity of resources in the market economy, combined with an adherence to a production model of endless growth, brings out a lot of fear in our artistic pursuits, and it really shuts down, right, our true purpose. Like when funding is slashed, and then everybody's like, "Oh, what are they getting? What are they getting?" And everyone's holding their cards really close to their chest. I think this is really deadly. So then what happens is we become part of a culture of protectionism, right, instead of caring. That's harmful to art, and that's harmful to us. So by collaborating, and I mean true collaboration, which is having from the root, where we share resources and we share the development and execution of an idea, we can build relationships that will lead to meaningful work that deepens engagements with the public, and then the cycle continues. So on that note, I'll end with one idea from Lewis Hyde's wonderful book, The Gift: Creativity and the Artist in the Modern World. Art is a gift, and a gift that cannot be given away ceases to be a gift. The spirit of a gift is kept alive by its constant donation. This is when a gift truly comes into being. In this way, art can be a constant source of sustenance for us all. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Cheryl. That was wonderful, and we have time for some questions.
Yeah, don't be shy about the question thing. I always have anxiety when it comes to question period, and I'm like, I think I have a question, but I'm, always a little bit shy to say it. But the truth is, you should just ask.
You should just ask. And if it's a voice thing, you can whisper in my ear, and I'll bring it to Cheryl, or all kinds of options. But I get to start with a question first.
Hey, cool.
So, yeah, so many things I wanted to talk about and ask about. I love the phrase politicized sensuousness.
Oh, nice.
And that really speaks to me, because that's something that I've been trying to do in my work for a really long time, and that gives me a phrase to, as a point of orientation that I really liked. But yeah, I mean, it's so interesting to hear about generosity and giving in the context of the art world, which is, I think, can often be seen to be really exclusionary, and so I guess I wanted to have you speak to, like, if you've noticed any changes, like if the generosity that you're able to offer in that context is of a moment, or if it's something that it's like a radical act that pries open the possibility for more inclusion and for broader, more diverse audiences. Like, how does that? How have you noticed that in action? Have you noticed that as a kind of organizing principle for other institutions? Yeah.
I really feel that what I've observed over the last 30 years is that there are moments of intense generosity that actually come as a reaction to really intense injustice. And artists are very instrumental in, artists and cultural workers in general, come together and, want to do something. And I would say the last time that happened was in the early mid-90s, right? This was maybe a second wave of mobilization where artists and cultural workers became activists who were sort of, and it was a kind of, let's come together moment, instead of, where everyone's isolated and working, for their own benefit. It had a lot of growing pains, because people of color coming together with indigenous people were like, well, we're kind of imposed. You know, this kind of strategic, you know, essentialism is sort of foisted upon us. But perhaps yes, there were you know, sort of some frictions around that. But ultimately, I think it was a really beautiful time of you know, seeing what people can do and what art can do. So I see that go up and down, you know, and then I think people got super burnt out, you know, from all that work, and the discussion, but a lot of good things came out of it, you know, peer-run juries at the Canada Council happened. That wasn't a thing before. Changes, right, to competitions for grants at multiculturalism or at Heritage and the Canada Council, you know, and that was all that pushing, you know, that was all that kind of, we need to work together to try and make something happen. So there was a moment of generosity, went underground, and that's, I feel like events of 2020 have like created a really interesting moment for a galvanizing of generosity. And I'll give you a little anecdote. I was on the jury of for the Sobey Art Award this year. And we had it was such a difficult decision. That's always a tough one, to find one person out from the short list. And it's organized by region. And I was representing Quebec, you know, there's Ontario, there's the prairies in the north, and then there's the west. And in the past, and this is what we heard like after we'd done our work, was that juries got pretty nasty. It really came down to, you know, it's, you know, I'm fighting for my person kind of thing. Very territorial, very, yeah, out and out, you know, like knock down, drag out kind of, you know, exchanges. And we did not have that experience. I think we were, it was a really beautiful collegial moment. We let go of territory, we let go of my artist, and we said, like, let's look at this amazing group as a group of artists, and let's talk about what's at stake, let's talk about what's pertinent, what's moving us now, what really is being said. And we felt really good about that. And we felt like it was a kind of, maybe, hopefully, a new way of working together, you know, as a group of people just sort of thrown together. So that was a nice moment, a recent moment of generosity.
Yeah, it just started, a couple of wheels started turning. I was thinking about Montreal and like the possibilities for alternative or maybe even like utopian economies and social systems that do emerge, like not just artists who are engaged in social practice, but you know, art is a struggle, and to make it, you have to be in community. And I was thinking, because a class I taught yesterday, I was talking about Indigenous art and about the banning of the potlatch, and how it's so impossible to imagine a system of exchange other than capitalism. And so I was thinking about Montreal, and then so I moved there in '97, and I was there till like 2008. And in the late '90s, mid '90s, it was almost like a closed economy. Like it was still, you know, currency was the vehicle of exchange, but like at the Casa del Popolo, the bartender would be playing a show the next night, and then you'd buy a drink from them and tip them, and the person in the band on stage worked at the Fripp store down the street. And so there's this really beautiful integration of the cultural community with the economic community in Mile End and the Plateau. And yeah, it was just to what extent, like, is that an observation or a practice of yours that is related to the particular context of Montreal? Because it's not to diss Toronto or anywhere else, but I haven't been a part of the Toronto community at a moment where that was a possibility. It's just like too expensive now. It's too the loci of cultural production and consumption are kind of hidden a bit more. Yeah, could that happen
Yeah,
anywhere else?
I had not made that association, sort of my own personal philosophy and the Montreal, in particular, like, the Plateau is a very special, or Mile End is a really special neighborhood. And I think you might be onto something because, the time at Oboro, that was like, I don't know, 97 to 2007, that's on the Plateau. And all the folks that kind of that gravitate towards, an artist-run center, an artist-run culture, are very much about, how can we help each other? We're gonna, we're going to. Maybe it's also because there's a scarcity of resources. Montreal is a very kind of strange city from an economic standpoint, because it's since the first referendum in late 1970s, it really did, all of the wealth went down the 401, and it's been a bit of a place that has had to struggle, but also struggle can create some really interesting creative spaces, and it's still like that. So maybe there is something, to that experience and what's around that has really, brought that out. But I also think that, the Montreal art scene is not like is like any other. Do you know what I mean? In terms of a sense of competition that can come up between institutions. I think that's a very real thing, and it's something to resist. It really is an impulse to resist. So we're no better.
Can we get some questions from the audience? Jean-Paul.
Hi, Cheryl.
Hey.
Thank you very much. I wanted to go back to, because you have such an interesting track through your career, that has to do with screen-based technology, and to look at your work in the Unit D and its reaction, I think, to the kind of white male history of the NFB, an important history, and its divisions between animation or experimentation and documentary, and then in Unit D's kind of birth out of challenge for change, out of kind of like the position that someone like Tanya Ballantyne-Tree had been put into in that kind of older system. And then like with Bonnie Shear Klein's work around VTR Saint-Jacques, like that change into video, the change into seems to be really interesting about the kind of like the unification of technology and identity as a kind of form of an intersecting interlocutor that happens throughout your career, even with Oboro, right? Your work with Scawanetti, but also, like you were just saying, the dates, it takes place at a change in video production and a change in funding, where we have media arts being funded at at national levels. I'm wondering for yourself how you see your transition to Phi. I mean, I saw Ed Atkins up there, and I know that many of the first initial shows at Phi were like really looking at technology. How are you seeing kind of the changes in technology, maybe specifically in Montreal with the NFB moving downtown, or with the Phi Foundation? And what was that transition? How are you thinking about technology in your curatorial transition within those spaces?
Yeah, I lived that transition, right, between analog and digital, and it was a huge paradigm shift to go from syncing rushes or U-matic format editing to nonlinear editing, and it was hard. It was really, really difficult. At the same time, there was a lot of, working at the NFB, and because of budgets getting slashed, there was this kind of I don't know, I guess we can shoot it in video. which was really doing a disservice to the medium, given that artists like Nam June Paik and Paul Wong and all these amazing artists were using video and appreciating video for what it was, and I guess sort of between that kind of, binary and living through the shift to digital means, which also then, facilitated a lot of production, especially for women and people of color who, wanted to shoot in film but just couldn't afford it. But then saying, no, video's got a certain kind of agency with it that actually Paul Wong talks a lot about. And so I guess I really loved that tension, and I'm like, screw it, like I'm using video, I'm shooting on high 8, and I'm going to have fun with it, and we're going to own it, and we're not going to feel like second-class citizens because we're not using film, and then as over the years, the digital video has come to look incredibly amazing, which kind of makes me long a little bit for the high 8 days, when it was a specific aesthetic, and it's hard to find that technology anymore, but it had a certain beauty to it. And maybe it was beautiful also because it signified a kind of freedom, and that you did not have to be tied to these kind of financial constraints. I just know how hard it is to find money to make your art. And so, I think that kind of tension just makes you dig down, and look for the things that really explain the motivations for why you're doing what you're doing. And it's not just because I couldn't afford film. Does that answer a little bit?
Totally, that's great. Thank you.
It's a big question.
It's a huge question, but
yeah.
It's just such an interesting track throughout your career that it's like that you have these kind of firsthand interactions with these changes in technology. That idea of thinking about the once marginalized technology as a kind of place of refuge, right, where is really interesting.
Yeah, thanks for the question.
Well, and that's super interesting, and has me thinking also about, those sort of marginal media, consumer media, they were taken up by people who had marginal access to those kinds of technologies. So, like the Porta-Pack opened the gate for like women artists to that's the big boom in feminist video art, and so I was thinking about Hito Steyerl's Poor Image essay and the power of the lo-fi, and it's because it sticks to a marginal position, and so what do you think about the fact that many of us are able to afford or to have or borrow an iPhone that can produce images that you can easily project on a screen and have them look like pretty seriously cinematographic? So, are there no more poor images? Are there any ways of engaging with technology that you've been noticing that have that kind of have a patina or some sort of that in some way signify that they're a place, a refuge for people who do have less access to make work?
What I have noticed is that pretty much there's such a wide range of media to use that that I see photographers going kind of back to tintype, these or just sort of other pinhole cameras, like just this other type of way of engaging with technology, and with the understanding. And it's crazy because Ursula Franklin's street, I didn't know she had a street, and it's amazing because her book, or her Massey lectures, The Real World of Technology, they really do sort of help you understand what technology really means, and that there's regimes around technologies that control who uses them, how they're used, the right ways, the wrong ways to use them, and then actually, underneath it all, it's like to give us a certain empowerment, around technologies. And what artists do so well is to take technologies that were, say, created by a large corporation and do something completely not what it was supposed to do. Find glitches in things, make them, express something that was not at all the intention of the fabricator. And I guess to come back to, to the question, it's sort of like it's whatever works. I have no problem. I think it's great, if you have access to something, the whole sort of user-producer, I would call it wave of production that was coming up when smartphones came out and people could, create little apps and do crazy things that were, not at all what iPhone intended, you to be able to do. I think that's amazing. I think it's really fantastic and empowering, and I like that there's a range of things, that we're sort of loosening the grip on hierarchies of technology. That's, I think, very, very productive.
Other questions?
Yeah.
Hello. Hi.
Hi.
I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit more to that, one of the early slides you had with the 2 questions on it. What are my questions, and how can I be of service? I was wondering if you put those in that order on purpose, if you could just speak to a little more to that, yeah.
I'll be, I was really struggling in the MA. I'd been out of school for over 15 years, something like that, and I wasn't really sure, what to make or how to work with the readings I was given. I was sort of floundering, and I had to have a meeting with one of my professors, like media history professor, and he basically said that. He's like, something to ask yourself is, what is my question? He said, that's the hardest thing. It's the hardest thing to ask yourself. But it helped me, I asked myself that, in coming to this particular text, or coming to, and then by extension to any problem that I had, whether it was trying to figure out, an artwork or an exhibition proposal. It was like, well, what are my questions? How can I make this have meaning? If I'm just trying to check a box or please someone else, or meet the expectations of this, that, and the other, then that's not my question, and I'm never going to honor that question. So when I delve into, what do I really want to know, and what can I really look into that is going to make this have real meaning? Because if it doesn't have much meaning to me, it's not going to have any meaning to anyone else. So that's what is my question about. And then how can I be of service is sort of linked to that, because in thinking through your questions, you are thinking about how you can be of service. So being of service is really about that moment where you see what it is you can offer. When you see and you have a better grip anyway on how to make this meaningful for other people. And that's a real kind of, as an artist, but also as a curator, I think a really, it's helped me a lot. It's helped me a lot kind of get out of the trenches or the mess I'm in when too many other voices are coming into your head, and you're worried too much about, are they gonna like it, and is this gonna get a good review? And it doesn't matter. You speak from your own questions and trust yourself, and it's gonna I would say 99.9% it's gonna be great.
Thank you.
There's this lecture series in Toronto called Trampoline Hall that's been going on for a long time. And the MC is this guy, Misha Gluberman, and at the beginning of it's a series of lectures given by people who aren't experts on the thing that they're lecturing on. And Misha always starts off by saying, talking about how there's going to be a Q&A afterwards. And he says, well, now we're going to go over what a question is. And I know that you all think you know what a question is, but this is how to ask a good question. If you feel a swelling of pride in your chest as you're getting ready to ask the question, and you're thinking about how smart you're going to look in front of all these people, that's not a question. He's just got this really funny list, and that has stuck with me so deeply because, relating that to the work that you do with, or the things that you're talking about in terms of gifting and those kinds of alternative economies, and I feel like a question really is like the potlatch of exchange, in that it's an act of generosity to somebody else to give them the opportunity to work something out for themselves in real time, but also to offer you something. But when it's a sincere question, it's also a genuine act of humility, and that's a really gift. That's a gift to give oneself. I've been wanting to design a course around asking a question. It's just a course about questions.
Yeah.
Which leads me to asking you a question about, because I did want to ask you about research, because as you were talking about how difficult your MA was, and you weren't sure what the questions were, or you came together when you were given that prompt. How do you how do you practice your research in relation to your curatorial practice, your art practice? And I'm asking this kind of on behalf of the students here, because our program is, one of its characteristics is it's really heavily research oriented for an art program. And I always try to ask this question of all our guests, because I deliberately chose or curated this series around people who I think ask really good questions, who have really rigorous, deep research practices, but who are also really skilled practitioners. So yeah, how I don't know now I don't know what the question is, but is it a process of going back and forth between practice and research? Are they just so thoroughly integrated that you don't really know the difference between the two? What does that look like for you?
Oh, the practice and research. Yeah. They speak to each other all the time. Yeah, so it is a kind of dialogue between practice and research, for sure. But there's I would say, when you're doing a solo exhibition with a living artist, sort of a monograph, it really is more, the research is actually in the relationship. I mean, definitely you're checking out their work, and you're sort of thinking about the spaces, and you're thinking about what would work and what would create sort of what might communicate, the story of an artist's work. But what mostly it happens within the relationship that you build together as you're going through the process of working on a show. And so that kind of research, it's a different kind of research, but I think it's almost bigger in a way. I mean, artists do want to know, right, that you understand some of the, the major tenets of their practice, and that you, have very specific ideas about what you would like to present, but also with respect to, the given space. But I'd say probably a little bit what edges over that is the research that you do in getting to know that person as a person, and letting them get to know you too, because there's going to be moments of great insecurity that come up. I was working with I don't think she would mind, with Barty Kerr, this She's a British artist, but she's been living in New Delhi since 1993. That's where she decided to go. It was New York or New Delhi, and she went to New Delhi. We had the show completely, almost like it was mapped out. It was, she'd approved the plans. We had, the works were in the spaces. They were conditioning in their spaces. And I think what I suspect is that she had another show mounting and someone dropped a work. And it completely destabilized, her and made her very nervous about our show and nervous about, maybe this shouldn't go there, or maybe and when a show of that magnitude with all the works that were coming and the value of the works, sort of handling is something you don't want to do too much of, and sort of rather than kind of like work everyone up into a lather and we got to change all this. This is gonna, it was like, let's just take a minute and and Bharti, the show is gonna be great. Everything that you've done here, all the decisions that you've made are amazing. And after that, and then it was okay. So I'm really grateful that we had some time, to build trust between each other, so that when that moment happened, we could just get real instead of like, I don't know, that would have been disastrous. Things were printed, you know what I'm saying? That would have been a tough one.
Other questions? Yeah, Sherry.
Hi, Cheryl.
Hi.
Thank you for your talk. I really resonated with like the topic of like service and like finding greater value in the work that you do. Like as the curatorial student myself, I think that's also like where I'm coming from with my practice. And but interestingly, your studio work that you talked about at the beginning also. I can see the connections from your studio work and your curatorial work, and I wanted to ask, like, it seems like in your studio practice, you engaged like interviewees a lot in your practice, and I wanted to ask, how did you choose these interviewees? Are they from your community? And how, like, the kind of practice of telling stories of others, how do you approach that? And also, when you think of service, do you think of like a specific subject of who would like receive the service through art? Is that subject a changing subject over time? Because I sometimes also think about that myself, and I feel like it's always changing, but also it's like stay within like a bigger parameter. So yeah, I just want to hear your thoughts on that.
Maybe I'll start with the second one. The service part, it's really, I think about, as a curator, I'm thinking about the artist, then I'm thinking about the team, the folks that are around that are going to, help, we're all gonna do this together. And I'm thinking of the communities that we serve. So it's sort of simultaneously on different levels at the same time, but it pretty much comes down to that same thing, which is taking the focus off yourself, and then trying to therefore kind of release yourself from the pressures of having the focus, it being about me. It's not about me, it's about that and that, having some kind of impact on people that's lasting and could be transformational. If it is, that's amazing. But maybe, they make a little more space for art and culture in their lives, sort of day to day. So that's how I kind of, think about culture. But the first part was about, the first question.
Choosing interviewees.
Yes, yeah. Do people know about a methodological approach called snowballing? It's basically what you would imagine, right? You put out a little feeler with people you know, and then you tell them what you're looking for, and then they sort of share their network with you, and then that network grows and grows and grows. So that was my, basic methodology, which I guess what people use, social media to do that too. I mean, that works as well. But I do have a sort of, I really want to have as wide-ranging a set of folks to interview as possible. So I want to make sure that there's a representation of, women who live in, each region of Canada as much as possible for that particular project, that their socioeconomic backgrounds were different, that when they came, where they were born, if they were born in Canada, and where, and what all the circumstances were around that, to try and again not let that discourse settle, but rather let it be as diverse as possible. So those are the kinds of things that guide my desire to, and I love to interviewing is kind of related to my time at the NFB, and that slide that I had with Dion Brand's film Sisters in the Struggle, that was the film that made me understand a little bit more about how you share the gift. There was such a generosity in how she directed that, and got such mind-blowing material out of everyday people. It was a film about what's it like to be a Black woman in the 90s in Toronto. And it was like, it was really a beautiful, short, I don't know, it was like a 45-minute film, but that was the thing that I was like, oh yeah, there's something really special there in that methodology.
Thank you very much.
No problem.
I think we have time for maybe one more question. Because also there's the standing invitation to talk about Yoko, but maybe that's not your question. So if there's a more specific question than a general Yoko question. Kei-san?
Hey, thanks so much for that. That was great. I was wondering if you could talk a bit about strategies of hybridity, both in your own work and the work that you curate. I thought that was a really interesting little node that I'd love to hear more about.
Yeah, strategies of hybridity is something, that's been, or hybridity as a concept has been pulled apart, a lot by scholars since Homi Bhabha, sort of talked about that in his Location of Culture book, set of essays. But then I mentioned Ian Ang because, I was kind of like, I always thought of myself as being a hybrid being, and I found that there was a lot of power and positivity in that experience, and it was what helped me kind of survive, moments where I had a lot of trouble with, coming into, who I thought I was, or what I was saying, or what my appearance was saying out there in the world. So I really wanted hybridity and hybridization to be a place of, a strategic place for survival. And there were parts of Bhabha's take on hybridity that that really spoke to me. I think he was also talking about class, class hybridity. But Ian Ang was talking about this space of real freedom, like real radical freedom, that takes you away from the idea of a central country complex. So for a Chinese person, mainland China is sort of the central country. It's like the authority on what Chineseness is and should be. And she's saying that hybridity actually can release you from, that sort of central tenet on what your Chinese identity is supposed to be and look like. And I really, found a lot of solace in that, and found it resonated a little bit more with my experience of recognizing that you can never know, and nobody is ever one thing. And when you kind of go through life explaining yourself, then you feel like, wow, there's just so many other people that have that same experience, and then there's kinship there. So the strategies of hybridity, which also call attention to sort of historical and cultural uneven dynamics of power, bringing stuff together, that's sort of like a subversive move in that way. It's saying that no, I don't just do video. I also want to make installation, and I want to bring those things together. Or I want to make documentary, but I want it to be experimental, and I want it to thwart some of the conventions, right, of truth claims, that documentaries are meant to say. And I'm doing that intentionally. I'm mashing up those two things specifically to call attention to those, I guess, established ways of doing things. So there's a little bit in there, and I think I'm still discovering more about what that means.
Thank you.
And I think we'll leave it there. So thank you so much, Cheryl, for being
Thanks,
here.
everyone. Thanks for being here.
And thanks to Renee and Satyam for running the show tonight. I really appreciate it. And we'll be back with 4 more talks in the winter. So I hope some of you are meant to be here, and you're all invited. So thanks and good night.
Thank you, Mitch. Thanks.